Imagine you're in Washington, D.C., in the summer of 1952. One night, the military suddenly starts getting reports about strange lights in the sky over the Capitol. At first, nobody's too worried. The Air Force got reports like this all the time. Someone saw an airplane and thought it was something else. Someone spotted a weather balloon. Sometimes people simply misidentified what they were looking at. Usually, that's the end of the story. But this time was different, because radar operators were seeing the same strange things too. And they weren't just showing up once. They kept coming back. Now you have a problem. You can tell one person they saw something wrong. You can blame bad weather. You can blame a piece of equipment. But when the radar starts picking it up too, you can't just shrug and move on. So what exactly was flying over Washington? It was 1952, right in the middle of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't officially at war, but both sides were watching each other very closely. American officials were already worried about spies, bombers, and the possibility of a surprise attack.
So when strange objects started appearing over Washington, the military's first thought wasn't aliens. It was the Soviet Union. Maybe someone was testing American defenses. Maybe there was some new kind of aircraft nobody knew about yet. And if that was true, this wasn't some weird little UFO story. It was a national security problem. On the night of July 19, radar operators at Washington National Airport noticed several unusual targets. The objects seemed to move in strange ways. Sometimes they appeared to speed up. Sometimes they changed direction. And nobody could immediately explain what they were. So naturally, the first thing they did was check the radar. Maybe the equipment was malfunctioning. That would actually have been the easy answer. But they didn't find a simple problem that explained everything. The targets were still there. And now people on the ground wanted to know what was happening in the sky above them. So the military sent fighter jets to investigate. And this is where the story gets really interesting. Picture being one of those pilots. It's nighttime. You're flying over Washington. Someone on the ground is telling you there's a radar target somewhere ahead of you. So you head over there. And when you arrive, nothing. You don't see anything.
Then the radar operator tells you the target is still there. Some pilots later reported seeing strange lights. Other times, the radar showed something that the pilot couldn't see at all. And that made the whole thing even harder to explain. Because one person seeing something strange is easy to dismiss. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they saw an airplane. Maybe they misjudged the distance. But now you have radar operators, radar equipment, and military pilots all reporting something unusual. You can't explain all of that away with one simple answer. Then, just when it seemed like the whole thing might calm down, it happened again. On the night of July 26th, more unusual reports started coming in over Washington. This time, the story got even more attention. The media started reporting on it. People began speculating. Maybe it was Soviet aircraft. Maybe it was some secret American project. And of course, some people thought the explanation was much stranger. Maybe these were UFOs. Today, that might sound like a weird story.
But put yourself in Washington in 1952. You're living through the Cold War. You hear reports of unexplained objects over the Capitol. The military sends fighter jets into the sky to investigate. That's enough to make people nervous. The Air Force already had a program for investigating reports like these. It became known as Project Blue Book. Starting in 1952, the program collected and investigated thousands of UFO reports. And the numbers are pretty remarkable. By the time Project Blue Book ended, it had collected 12,618 reports. Of those, 701 were still officially classified as unidentified. Now, there's an important detail here. Unidentified does not mean alien. It simply means the investigators couldn't determine what the object was. That's it. A lot of the reports eventually had ordinary explanations. Aircraft, weather balloons,
Atmospheric conditions. Or sometimes the person who saw it simply got it wrong. So when you see the number 701, it would be misleading to say the U.S. government had admitted to 701 alien encounters. That's not what the records say. It means that after the investigation, some cases were still unresolved. And honestly, that's the part I find most interesting. Because even after you explain the obvious cases, there are still a few that don't fit neatly into one answer. The Washington sightings are a good example. One explanation that was later discussed involved temperature inversions in the atmosphere. Under certain conditions, changes in the atmosphere can affect how radar signals behave and can create confusing returns. That's a reasonable explanation for at least some of what happened. But it didn't settle every question. There were still witness reports. There were still radar records. And there were still disagreements over exactly what people had seen. So, more than 70 years later, people are still asking the same basic question. What was actually happening over Washington that summer? And this is where I think the story gets more interesting than the usual "were they aliens" question.
Because the evidence doesn't prove that aliens were flying over Washington. It doesn't. What it does prove is something much more interesting in its own way. In 1952, the U.S. military really did scramble fighter jets over the nation's capital because of objects it couldn't immediately identify. This wasn't some internet legend that appeared decades later. There were radar reports, there were pilot reports, there were military investigations. And eventually, there was an entire government program that spent more than 20 years trying to figure out what people were seeing. Project Blue Book finally ended in 1969. The records were later transferred to the National Archives, where many of them can still be examined today. So, were the objects over Washington extraterrestrial? Honestly, we don't have enough evidence to say that. Some of the sightings probably had ordinary explanations. Some remained unresolved. But one thing is certain. For a few nights in the summer of 1952, something was happening over the U.S. Capitol that the military couldn't immediately explain. And maybe that's why the story has lasted so long. Not because it proves that aliens came to Earth, but because, after all these years, we still don't know exactly what some of those people saw.